My name is Daniel Adibi, and I'm your host for Our World 101, the show in which we discuss complicated, real-world events and issues to bridge people together. Today's topic is diversity, equity, and inclusion in the education system through teacher representation and through educational methods. Here to speak with us today is Sharif El-Mekki, the founder and CEO of the Center for Black Educator Development, an organization that takes action to recruit Black educators and to implement new revolutionary teaching styles in schools. Mr. El-Mekki believes that by having more Black educators and by implementing these new teaching methods into schools, it will empower Black students and motivate them to accomplish more. So, Mr. El-Mekki, welcome to the show. We are really excited to have you here.
Thanks for having me. Good morning.
So you are the founder and the CEO of the Center for Black Educator Development. Can you describe what the center does as an organization?
Yeah, absolutely. First off, the Center for Black Educator Development was designed to help rebuild a Black teacher pipeline, both locally and nationally. We look at rebuilding the Black teacher pipeline through three lenses, or three pillars, the three Ps as we call them. One around policy and advocacy. What are the policies and advocacy efforts that can support rebuilding a Black teacher pipeline? Secondly, professional learning. Like, what's the mindset, the skill that educators, both Black educators as well as those who are, who are also in the system, what can they do to also have the right mindset that supports aspiring as well as veteran Black educators? And then thirdly, pathways. How do we engage high school youth, college youth to think about teaching as a career? And so each of those have, components, particularly the pathways. The pathways is really a high school kind of career and technical education component. Imagine teaching 101 as you're a high school student, as you're matriculating through high school. College students as well, engaging them, paid apprenticeship, CTE credits. And then also we offer a fellowship, this Black Teacher Pipeline Fellowship that provides financial support while students are in college, as well as retention bonus and support as they matriculate throughout their career. So Black Teacher Pipeline stood up by pillars: policy, professional learning, and pathways.
And I know you're using the term Black Teacher Pipeline a lot. Can you explain for our viewers what that means?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can imagine that right now, for example, I started teaching in 1993. And I was part of a number. Less than 2% of public school teachers in America are Black men. Less than 2%. But right now, I think that number hovers around 1.3% of all public school teachers are Black men. And we see even places like Philadelphia that's very diverse, has a high percentage of Black students, Black citizens. That number is about 24%. But what the Black Teacher Pipeline also represents, the amount of people who looked at leading a classroom as a viable career choice, and what we're doing to address the issues that undermine that pipeline. So, for example, something that's often lauded, the Brown versus Board of Education ruling by the Supreme Court in 1954, that actually, while it had, some clear messages about integration, it also deconstructed a Black teacher pipeline. It put holes in it. And you can imagine these districts who said, okay, yes, we'll integrate, we'll take some Black students, but we won't take the teachers who were caring for them, who knew them, who were from their communities. And so tens of thousands, some numbers go between 40 to 80,000 Black teachers were demoted, fired, laid off as a result of the 1954 ruling. Here in Philadelphia, just over the last 2 years, Research for Action did some data analysis that showed that Philadelphia employs 1,200 less Black teachers now than they did before. So I mentioned Philadelphia, 24% of the public school teachers are Black today. At one point, that number was closer to 40% of the public school teachers. And mind you, the students are about 60-something percent. And so nationally, 80% of public school teachers are white. and it wasn't always the case.
And how do you believe that having more Black educators, like having a larger percentage, will empower students? How does having more Black educators kind of impact students, and how does that help them?
Oh, absolutely. And the research is pretty profound, deep, and extensive around the impact of same race teachers, particularly for Black students. And we know short term, like that year, Daniel, if I was a student in a classroom and I had a Black teacher, on average, imagine across the country, I would have, less suspensions, expulsions, even referrals for discipline. I'd have there would be better communication between home and school. I'd have more access to rigorous courses. I'd be, honors classes, AP courses. I'd be less likely to be sent to special ed, excuse me, and misdiagnosed. Um, I'd have less racist curricula being taught to me, and I'd have more affirming spaces around it. People would have my teacher would have higher expectations for what I can achieve, more interest in my aspirations, more understanding of where I come from. That's just that year. But people like Dr. Constance Lindsay out of University of North Carolina and her colleagues looked at long term, like what's the impact long term if a Black student has a Black teacher. And what they found was I would be less likely, me as that student, I would be up to 39% less likely to drop out of school if I had a single Black teacher. And I would be up to 29% more likely to enroll in college. So not only do we see short-term impact, it's long-term impact as well. And it's not new. We know that Caroline LeCount back in the 1800s was saying that we needed more Black educators for Black students in the 1800s, and now it's 2023. So it's been a long pressing issue, and they've seen, and some of these studies have been done across multiple states, looking at hundreds of thousands of Black students. And what we also know that white students, there's no detriment to them to have that Black teacher as well. And many white students are also saying like, hey, we'd like to have more diversity in our educator workforce as well, because that they may interrupt what we're, the narrative, the expanding what history is. Is history of this country really only George Washington and Thomas Jefferson? There's no other, contributions. Are there no other things that happen, that other perspective experiences and voices that we should bring into the classroom? That's what a diverse educator workforce can do and can bring to the classroom and make it more robust, more rigorous, and actually more holistic.
Yeah, and I remember when I was looking through your organization's website, in addition to talking about, recruiting more Black educators, it was also mentioning that your organization tries to implement new teaching methods into schools. So I'm wondering, what teaching methods are you talking about, and what exactly needs to change from traditional schooling methods?
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, a lot of the teaching methods that are used that teachers are trained and developed in are a center European kind of thinking, white American thinking. So imagine most teachers, when they go to school to learn how to teach, they learn about white educational theory and white behavior theory. They learn about Horace Mann and John Dewey and B.F. Skinner and Piaget. They're learning a very, narrow, myopic view of what teaching and learning is. And then the majority of public school students are actually non-white across America. And so that means that they're using Sigmund Freud and Piaget's philosophies, but not understanding how did Piaget and Freud think about Black and brown communities. You're applying philosophies and theories to students that, these theorists didn't even recognize that they would be in these schools with these numbers. And so what we're challenging folks to do, to actually look at other educational theory and like what's the relationship in those communities to teaching and learning. How have they viewed that? What did like Dr. Carter G. Woodson, Caroline LeCount, Mary McLeod Bethune, what have they offered to the educational landscape that would be beneficial to the students that we have today? And so when we talk about pedagogy, it's also orientation. Like, how do you think about those children, their aspirations? We know that we can look at schools right now and they look just like they did in the 1800s. You know,
Yeah. Mhm.
straightforward desk. People were being sent to school to ultimately learn how to be in factories for the most part. And this is how the school system was operating. Well, what were different ways, to think about educating children, and how would that, live? The number one thing is expectations. The Black teacher is more likely to see a Black student as a future graduate. Same student, um, same grade, same scores. A white teacher with a constricted mindset or racial biases may look at that kid as ultimately, oh, he can't handle this, or he can't learn this, or she's unable to benefit from a rigorous coursework. And so these mindsets are pretty pervasive in our school systems, unfortunately. And we see it not only through research, but through anecdotal history of the racial biases that undermine children's expectations. And imagine that across 13 years. Yale, for example, and I'll end with this. Yale did a study that showed that um, Black students experience their teachers' racial biases as early as 3 or 4 years old. That's preschool. And it doesn't get better by third grade or eighth grade or 11th grade. If anything, it calcifies. And it really shows like you're not really a part of this, even though you're within this system. So, but there's hope. There's Black teaching traditions that actually center students, that uplift students, that has high expectations and high levels of support. But the main thing is around the mindset. What's the mindset about your students, what they can achieve, how successful they can be? Mindsets matter most where we come from.
Yeah. And I think, obviously, recruiting more Black educators and kind of changing the mindset of education systems, that's so important. And from what you're saying, it could really help to make, kids feel more inclusive in school. How is your organization kind of ensuring that that happens? How is your organization taking action to recruit more Black educators or to change those mindsets of education?
Yeah, as far as the recruitment, we started actually with retention. We get calls from all over districts all over the country. Is like, you know, El-Mekki, we want to recruit. Can you help us? We can't find Black teachers. And our first question is, what's your retention plan? And so many districts, Daniel, you'd be shocked to hear how many districts just don't have a retention plan. They haven't thought about retention. They're chasing the vacancies that they might have in the fall, but they haven't really thought of what's the ecosystem I'm inviting people into. We often say, Dr. Martin Luther King at one point around integration, he said, I fear that I'm integrating my people into a burning house. Talking about just the, again, mindset of like, all right, you integrated this Woolworth or, this system, whether it's transportation or otherwise, schools, movie theater, is that, but what's the mindset of the people there? Like, I'm integrating into a burning house. It's like it's not comfortable even once you get there. And sometimes we have to be careful that we're not integrating Black educators into a burning schoolhouse or burning school district, right? Where the mindsets, right? It's one thing to talk about a pipeline. It's another thing to talk about the ecosystem that pipeline runs through. And so for us, that's a big part of it, as far as recruitment, making sure that people are aware. We provide professional development from Philadelphia to Fresno, California, and everywhere in between, where we partner with districts, university professors. We have curricula and coursework, both synchronous and asynchronous, that educators are using across the country, both undergraduate students as all the way to leadership teams in schools and districts. But then our main work is working with high school students. Imagine being in high school and taking a course teaching 101, so to speak, as you matriculate through high school. Being able to practice teaching. Because a lot of times districts think that, oh, if you're interested in teaching, because you're a student, it will just organically happen and you'll eventually graduate, you'll come back and you'll want to teach. We say, like, why let it organically happen? Why not introduce and be very deliberate and thoughtful about what does it mean to teach? Because just because you're a student doesn't mean that you learned how to teach, or even that your interest peaks. Some people are becoming teachers despite the experience they had as a classroom student, or because they want to change the experience that they had as students. And they say, hey, I don't want another student, a younger generation, younger sibling, my own children, to go through what I went through in school. So I'm going to become a teacher to change that experience for hundreds, maybe even thousands of children.
Yeah, and that brings up another point I wanted to talk about, which is that I remember reading that Black students a lot of times will show an interest in education and becoming a teacher, yet they don't pursue a career in education.
Mhm.
And I think, your work is really with high school students is kind of focusing on trying to get those students to become educators and, to eventually restore the Black teacher pipeline. Can you, I guess, describe where the disconnect happens between the interest in education and the career in education?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And you know what? It's so interesting that yes, there's actually a high interest in teaching in African American communities. But different conditions and policies can dissuade that interest and undermine it. So, for example, one, we talked about just the experience of being a student. And so maybe you started off in elementary, like, oh yeah, I would love to lead my own classroom one day. But as you get
Mhm.
older, because of experiences that you may have, you may say, like, you know what, I don't want to be. Like we've had students who told us, like, you know what, I thought about not becoming a teacher because I didn't want to work with colleagues like my teachers. I didn't want to be their colleague in the future. And not necessarily just them, but just you know, uh their that prototype or that other type of colleagues who may be like the teacher that I had. And some are saying, like, you know what, I'm gonna consider becoming a teacher I wish I had and knew I needed, right? And so giving them the opportunity to do that. If they look at the curricula and they say, I never saw myself within it, or when the teacher taught, it was almost like, we never, no one else had any contributions to civilization that look like me based off of what I was taught. And I know that's not true, right? But so when they're exposed to actually, a more global history and contributions and inventions and how the contributions of their people have been to civilization, then it's more, a more profound invitation to enter the classroom. But then we also have to look at policies. There's so many people, who are Black and brown who may be first generation college goers, which means these are the first time they're seeing bills like this. College bills, are pretty massive and they continue to grow. Imagine never seeing those type of bills as a first gen, college goer. And so now that's also being introduced. So the financial constraints of being able to participate in, and it's expensive to become a teacher. You have to usually get your master's, you have to get certification, you need your clearances. Unfortunately, you'll probably have to buy some of your supplies. All of these things add up. So there are some even financial issues that, these are things that we try to, students who come through our program, high school students, and then declare that they want to be a teacher and they're majoring, we give them financial support in college. But then also when they get to their fifth year of teaching, we also provide them with a bonus, a retention bonus. So we try to look at, okay, what's all of the issues that may undermine or poke holes in this pipeline, and how do we address it in strategic ways? And we can't, boil the ocean and do everything, but we've chosen a couple of, key points. But the early exposure and clinical experiences while they're in high school, the support both financially as well as a network and mindset issues in college and then beyond.
Yeah. I also think, it's especially important that students will want to pursue a career in education because then by doing so, they will help to restore the Black teacher pipeline. And then in turn, that will help more students. So I think, that's really important work that your organization is doing in helping students become educators.
Yeah, Daniel, thank you. You lift up a key point. For us, it's an intergenerational model, and
Mhm.
it's one of the ways that we think has always been important. And when you look at the research, so many students of color are actually invited into the profession by teachers of color,
Yeah.
or influenced by teachers of color, which causes them to think like, oh, wait a minute, I can do this, right? Like even myself, I was on my way to law school. Dr. Martin Ryder, Black man, veteran educator in the school district of Philadelphia, invited me into the profession and said, oh, no, you should consider teaching. You should consider. I had never even thought about uh, teaching as a career. I knew I wanted to engage in social justice, but I thought I would do that through law. But when this Black man invited me into the profession and said, like, no, you're not only are you worthy, we need you. It landed differently, and I was like, oh, all right, I'll consider. But imagine if that was we're doing that, and this was after I graduated from college. So I started doing, imagine we're now doing that in high school, inviting them into the profession. But I'd also say, when after I was teaching and became a principal, we were engaging other Black men educators. We were all connected. 17 of us, and we would, monthly support each other and have these, kind of affinity spaces, so to speak, before they were called them affinity spaces. We were just all educators, Black men. And what we realized was not a single one of us had been invited into the profession while we were in high school or college. We had all been approached after we graduated from college. So, and we found that to be weird. Like 17, Black men, we were all successful, all in Philadelphia. We were from all over the country, but we were all working in Philadelphia. And at one point we said, what, let's ask our colleagues. Most of our colleagues are white women to be exact. And the average response that they gave to us about when they were tapped on the shoulder and asked to consider teaching was third grade. So third grade was when they remember some adult saying, hey, you'll be a great teacher. And for us, it was after we had got our college degree. So post-bac for one group, third grade for another group. And we're saying like, hey, there's something amiss here. And so part of our work is to engage. We don't really work with third graders in that way, inviting them, but at least in high school, we're having these clear conversations. We wrote a pretty robust curricula for high schools to use as part of their CTE model, career technical education model. And think about that. Pennsylvania just recently has CTE for high school students who are interested in teaching. They've had it for early ed, like pre-K. They had it for welding, maintenance, all kind of things, carpentry, right? You can get career and technical education courses. They have whole buildings devoted to that. They didn't have anything for teaching until last year for CTE. And that just seems like a miss. Like you have to hire teachers every year. Philadelphia has to hire about 700 teachers every single year. That's a lot of teachers. And they did not have a teacher academy. But we have it for all that. We even have it for maintenance. We have CTE for maintenance, but not for teaching. And so that part of our work is to address that and change that. So we're grateful to outgoing former administration. Governor Wolf signed into law, into the school code to be able to have CTE credits as high school students. And now we're working with some schools and districts across the state to now implement that, which is an important part of the pipeline.
Yeah. And I'm just keeping thinking about, how your colleagues said that they were, gotten interested in teaching in third grade versus all of you, in college or after. I just think that's a huge disparity. And I think that makes your work even more important. I'm wondering, I remember going on your website and I saw that you've held many workshops to promote cultural and professional teaching. Can you describe some of these workshops to us and kind of how they work?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have both in person, we have webinars, we have e-learning modules. Almost imagine like, a long distance course, but you can kind of download and take the course and matriculate through at your own, convenience. So a lot of these are centered on the competencies that we think every teacher should have in order to be effective. And they are really for any teacher, for any students, but they're particularly important for anyone who teaches Black and Brown students.
Mhm.
So an example of that is like, identity. A lot of people think like, oh, we don't need to do that. We don't need to think about identity. I'm colorblind. As soon as you say that, what you're saying is my default is white and European, and I'm erasing everyone else, from it. To be able to teach and understand, like, okay, what voices. When I was a teacher, the main thing I wanted students to do, not only to be literate, I was a literature and social studies teacher, so I wanted them to be literate, but also wanted them to be able to analyze whether it's the text we're reading now or just in life, what's being communicated and whose voices, perspective, and experiences are centered and whose is missing, right? Even just having that kind of view and understanding, you'll be better set to be a critical thinker, because ultimately that's what we need. We need citizens who are critical thinkers and be able to do that. It's harder for you to be a critical thinker if you feel like, I can erase um, other perspectives and experiences, and I'm unconscious of what is the dominant voice and perspective and experience in my curricula, in my teaching, and so forth. Right. So just being able to step back and critically analyze that, be reflective, but also solicit feedback. Right. Imagine if all teachers are also receiving feedback from students about how they experience their class, the curricula, their teaching style, as opposed to this is how it is, just deal with it.
Yeah.
Where students going to learn the most, and how do teachers improve, how do principals improve, how do superintendents improve if they're not soliciting feedback from those who are being served. And so a lot of that, our workshop is dealing with mindset and skills of how do you most effectively educate, but particularly educate students of color who may receive all kind of anti-Black, anti-Brown messaging throughout society. They shouldn't also experience it in your classroom as well.
Mhm. And I'm also wondering, for our viewers, how can individual students and teachers begin to promote inclusivity and cultural diversity at their own schools? So basically, in other words, how
Mhm.
can people, at schools who are not necessarily involved with an organization such as yours, how can people begin to accomplish your goal?
Yeah, no, I think the first part is just being reflective and being open and having a mindset that, mindsets matter most, right? Really, it starts with our mindsets of like, okay, how are people experiencing me, and being curious about that, So the first thing is really saying like, okay, how are you experiencing my classroom as a Black student, as a brown student? I might be a STEM teacher. How are the young women in my classroom experiencing STEM teaching? When we talk about how many young ladies, girls in school feel like they're being erased in their science classes and being told
Mhm.
like, oh, you're not good enough to be here. You don't really belong here. Like even today, people are still receiving this message. Was speaking to a astronaut, and she said that she just left a school where students were told by their counselor, and this we're not talking about the 50s and 60s. We're talking about 2020, a couple months ago, this last school year, where young girls are being told like there are no Black astronauts, so that's not something that you should consider. Even today, these type of messages, both spoken out loud or implied, are being sent to students. Overall, that you don't quite belong. You don't belong in rigorous coursework. You don't really. This isn't really your world. And so and we have to remember, Daniel, also that bias. It's not a new concept. Although people are like going crazy about, oh, bias. I don't have bias. Bias is a psychological term. Human beings all have biases, right? But if we ignore them, then we think like we don't have them. But human beings have biases. Some biases protect us, some undermine community and effectiveness and efficiency. And so we have to really recognize that and make that a part of our thinking as educators. And okay, and consider what biases, and not just like, oh, this is what I think, also soliciting the feedback so it can expose to us where else we might need to work. And the best place to start is with our students and the families that love and support them.
Yeah. And I think, what you're saying just makes your work even more important, where, school's supposed to be a place where you develop your interests, you become interested in careers, not a place where you get discouraged. And I
Mhm.
think it's really just, there's no other way to describe it other than systemic racism that still is inside our schools. And, something that really needs to be fixed. And I think what you're doing with your organization is so incredibly, important and so powerful. So I just wanted to thank you for all the work that you're doing.
No, thank you. Thank you for the platform and thank you for your interest and your work of lifting up, as you in your opening, complicated issues to discuss and to deal with.
To all our viewers, I hope you'll join us again for our next episode. I'm Daniel Adibi, and I'll see you soon.